So in the last lecture, we looked at the same example in terms of autarky. What we're going to do now is look in terms of open economy, where we're going to allow Kenya and the EU to trade with each other. So Kenya here is in red, and in green is the EU. What we established yesterday was the terms of trade per country. When it was in autarky, the terms of trade in Kenya was 6 food per one chemical, and in the EU was 4 food per one chemical. So now we're gonna hypothesize 5 different things or 4 different things. What I did is actually add the first and second condition to each other because it's just merely a discussion. You can draw a graph for it, but I've decided not to draw a graph for it. So we're gonna assume world prices. So based on 4F and the 6F here we got, terms of trade of 4F and 6F, and assume the first idea is what if prices in the world was more than 6F per one chemical, or if it was less than 4F per one chemical. And then the second scenario we can assume is what if it is equal to 4 food per chemical. And then in the third scenario we can look at what if it's equal to 6 food per chemical. And then the last one is what if the prices lie between 4 food and 6 food. This is the terms of trade. So let's look at the first example. So in the first example or the first scenario, what if the prices is more than 6 food? If the prices is more than 6 food, in terms of Kenya's normal pricing is 6 food per one chemical. Anything bigger than 6 food is going to mean that chemicals have become more expensive, which means that because chemicals is becoming more expensive, in terms of you're producing for 6F, but you can sell for more than 6F in the world prices, you're going to jump into that production. Whenever a product becomes more expensive, under autarky, it was first a normal price, and then in the world price, it's more expensive than what it was in your country, then it's definitely incentive for you to sell that product. Why? Because you can produce at a certain price and sell it for a lot more. So that's incentivized enough. So anything more than 6F for this country means all production is going to shift towards chemicals because chemical pricing has increased, which stimulates production. So you're only producing chemicals here. What's happening in terms of the EU? What is their prices? Their prices was 4F per one chemical. Now it is 6F, more than 6F per one chemical. What does that do? Anything greater than 4F per one chemical means that chemicals are becoming more expensive, meaning all production is going to shift towards chemicals. What is the problem here? What happened in Kenya with the prices being more than 6F? They shifted to chemicals. What happened to EU? A price bigger than 6F is forcing also the EU to produce chemicals. So both countries are producing chemicals. Is that possible? That is possible, but what happens? What is the one assumption we had? A country needs to consume both foods and chemicals. If both countries both countries are only producing chemicals, there is only chemicals to consume. So that means it can't exist. There cannot be an equilibrium condition because it breaks the assumption of a country wanting food and chemicals. In the second part of the first scenario, what if it was less than 4F per one chemical? Anything less than 4F per one chemical, if we look in terms of the EU, if it's the original price under autarky was 4 food per one chemical. Now anything less than 4F, say 3.5. If it's now 3.5, it means chemicals is becoming cheaper, which means food is becoming more expensive. And now since there's more profitability in shifting towards food because you can produce at a quarter. Remember, it's the reverse. If you look in terms of food, it's 1/4. But just explain everything in terms of carbon. In terms of chemicals. So chemicals are becoming cheaper when it's 3.5, meaning food is becoming relatively more expensive. And that means that all production is going to shift towards food because there's now more profitability in the high price of food. So all production shifts towards food. What is the problem here with in terms of Kenya? In Kenya, they're producing 6F per one chemical. Now the price is less than 4F. As say again, 3.5. If it's at 3.5, it means that chemicals have become cheaper, means that food has relatively become more expensive. And because they have become more expensive, that's enough incentive to shift all production towards food. So that what we find now is both the EU and Kenya are both shifting all the production towards food because food prices have increased relative to the autarky prices when compared to the world prices. And you cannot have the scenario where both of them are producing food. Unfortunately not. So because both of them producing food that is not equilibrium condition, we need some chemical to be produced in this society or in this world scenario. Okay, moving to scenario 2. So in scenario 2, we're going to assume because there cannot be more than 6F and 4F, so it's somewhere between or equal to the prices. So we're going to assume scenario 2, what if it is equal to 4F? Okay, so at terms of trade at 4F, in terms of the EU, what is the EU's pricing in under autarky or their production also? Their production and their pricing is at 4F per 1C. So prices at 4F means there's nothing really changing. There is nothing happening in terms of the EU. The pricing is exactly the same. They're not benefiting or they're losing out in this in any case. So they're staying exactly the same. If you had to draw that line in, the new profit line in, you would take a dotted line, but unfortunately it's going to take too long to draw a dotted line. I'm going to use, let's do black as example. So that line would align exactly on here. No change for the EU. In terms of Kenya, what is happening? Their original pricing is 6 food per one chemical. They have a new world. This is, remember this, in terms of the line is both their PPF, the budget line, if you can see it in that terms, and the pricing line coincide with each other. So let's leave the budget line here. We're creating this new world price of 4F. Is 4 flatter or steeper line? 4F is a flatter line. So if we draw in the flatter line, it will come in something like this. It will be parallel to that line because they're the same slope. And when you draw this line in, it's going to intersect at this point here, which is the food only side. In terms of explanation, what would you say? So their new world price is for food. For food is smaller than 6F, meaning that the price of chemicals has gone down from 6F under autarky to the new world price of 4F. And because chemicals is cheaper now, that means that what is more expensive? Food. And because food is more expensive, all production is going to shift towards food. There's more profitability in terms of that. And because they're going to shift all their production towards food, that means they're going to produce how much? 30. This is how much they can produce under their labor and that constraints. The maximum food they can produce is 30, which we established in the previous class. So they produce 30. So in terms of graphically, that point is where the black line and the red line would intersect. This is the point of production, but this is the graph as you draw. So that is your budget line here, the red line, and the black line is the new world price. So they are producing 30 food. What is the EU producing? We don't know. They're producing somewhere on this line according to what they're producing under autarky. So they're still exactly on the line, same scenario as before. But what can happen in terms of Kenya? Can they trade? What if they traded this 30 food? Remember now they're producing 30 food because the incentive of the world price at 4F allows them to produce or has shifted the production towards food. It's now more profitable for them to produce food. So this 30 food they can trade. And what prices can they trade? They can trade this 30 food they're producing in the economy at the world price. What's the world price? For food. So 4 food per 1 carbon. So this 30 food can now be traded at the price of 4 food per 1 carbon, which means you're going to say 30, and you can divide that by how much? By 4, and that will give you 7.5. So their 30 foods traded at the new price of the world at 4 food per 1 carbon is equal to 7.5 chemicals they can produce. So this axis here will be 7.5. So what did they have gained? It's effectively, if they had been under autarky, their 30 food could only be traded at the 6F to 1C ratio, which means they would have gotten 5. Under the world scenario, their 30 food, instead of now shifting production, all they do is sell it outwardly to the EU, and that entire 30 can generate them at the world price decided at 4 food per 1 carbon, will result in 7.5 carbons or chemicals, if we think as carbon as a chemical. So here you have 7.5 chemicals produced. And what is the gain? The gain is 2.5 chemicals. 7.5 minus 5. And that is the gain for Kenya. So Kenya is the only one that gains in the scenario when the prices are 4 food per 1 carbon. So let's go on to the other example. Let's go on to the third scenario. So under the third scenario, we have now the world price to be 6 food. So let's look at it in terms of Kenya. Let's throw in that line. What is Kenya's normal production? Kenya's normal production line under autarky was 6 food per 1 carbon. And the autarky price is also 6 food per 1 carbon. Now we find the world price is 6 food per 1 carbon. Does that change anything for them? No. That's exactly the pricing that would have been in terms of the economy. So again, we find that the line, the new world price line, will coincide with a budget line or with a PPF or PPC. Exactly the same place. But okay, so now that's Kenya. Nothing has changed for Kenya. We move to the EU. What did they initially face? Initially, they faced 4 food per 1 carbon under autarky. This is also what they produce at. Now, the world has come along and says, no, you can sell whatever you produce in your society, which is 4 food per 1 carbon, and that terms of trade. The terms of trade is now 6 food per 1 carbon, meaning the price of carbon has gone up. The prices of carbon has gone up by 2. And because carbon has become entirely more pricier, all production is going to shift towards carbon. So you find that EU is going to produce entirely carbon. They're going to produce at this point here the maximum amount of carbon because of the profitability in carbon, because of the price going up from 4 food per 1 carbon and the autarky to a world price of 6 food. What does that mean in terms of a line putting? So 4 food and 6F. 6F is a steeper line. So let's draw in a steeper line, still in black. I prefer if you draw this line in dotted, right? This is the type of calculation, a graphical calculation, that I would definitely give you in exam or test at some stage. Lucky you're not writing model tests, I probably would have tested in there first. So let's not use the word definitely, there's a high probability you will see this in your exam, because that's the only other form I'm going to be able to test you in, because you'll be writing essays for your assignments. So we drew this line in. We're going to work on what this value is. This is your budget line or your PPF, and this here is your world price. So what happens? Initially speaking, every 1 carbon could have been traded for 4 food, which means your 25 carbon would give you 100. 25 times 4. Now this 25 carbon can be traded what? At the world price of 6 food if we're going to go towards Kenya to trade. So this line being 6 food per 1 carbon, every 1 carbon is worth 6. So 25 carbons are worth how much? 25 carbons times by 6. What does that give you? 125. Put that value in here. 125. So whenever I ask you this type of explanation, for the first one you realize you can just discuss it in terms of word. In the second scenario, you need to be able to discuss it in terms of pricing. What incentive it is in terms of the Kenya, what incentive it is in terms of EU, and then you need to talk about who gains and what do they gain by. So in scenario 3, what happens here? They now can get 125 food for their 25 carbon. What did they get under a closed world? In the closed economy on autarky, they got 100. So the profit or the gains to trade from being under open world is 25. So Kenya remains the same, but the gain for the EU is 25. So you just put there 125 minus 100 equals to 25 food they would gain. Yeah, what's the name gain? 2.5 carbon, just for a reminder. Okay, so that's the second scenario, third scenario. And in the fourth scenario, what can happen? The fourth scenario means now there can be some price between 4 food per 1 carbon and between 6 food per 1 carbon. Maybe that's a bit more for you, and we're going to see that. So we're going to assume for our example, which is different from the textbook, we're going to assume the value is 5 food. Okay, 5 food per 1 carbon. 5 food per 1 carbon. We're going to start it in terms of Kenya first. In terms of Kenya, initially speaking, 1 carbon would have costed 6 food. Under the world prices, 1 carbon now costs 5 food. What does that mean? What does it mean now that the 1 carbon is now only 5 instead of being 6? So the value has dropped. So carbon has become cheaper, which means relatively speaking, food has become more expensive. That means production is going to shift for Kenya towards food because of the increase in profitability and price of food. Why? Because you can produce it at a cheaper rate and sell it for more in the world pricing. Okay, so let's draw that line in. 5F is a less steeper line. So it's maybe something like this. More flatter line, and there's your 5F line. You need to calculate this value. So what is happening? Kenya shift all the production towards food, so they're producing 30. Initially speaking, it was 6 food per 1 carbon, which meant that 30 divided by 6 would have gave you 5. But now it is only 5 food per 1 carbon in the real world. So it's going to be 30 divided by 5. Now 5 is 30 divided by the new world price of 5, and that will give you 6. So this value here is 6. So what do they gain? Kenya would have gained 1 carbon. And you need to write it there. Kenya gains 1 carbon. 6 minus 5. So now we're going to do a discussion in terms of the EU. So the EU, initially speaking, under autarky, they would produce food, or they would produce 1 carbon at 4 food. That was their terms of trade. That is also their pricing in terms of their country because it couldn't be anything else. So the production was exactly the same as the autarky in terms of trade. What has happened to the terms of trade now? The terms of trade has now increased to 5 food per 1 carbon. So initially speaking, their pricing was 4 food per 1 carbon. It's now gone up to 5 food per 1 carbon, meaning carbon has gotten more expensive. So now the incentive is to produce carbon entirely on itself. So what does that look like? So I'm going to draw the line in, for example. So this line was less steeper. Steeper line, higher number means a steeper line. We know that they're producing carbon only because the price of carbon has gone up. We need to determine what is this value over here. If you think about it, each carbon initially of 25 could be traded at 4 food per 1 carbon, meaning times 25. 25 times 4 would give you 100. Now, instead of trading at the autarky price, you are now exposed to the world price. The world price is 5 food. So every carbon can be traded for 5 food. So it's going to be 25 times 5, which is, yes, 125. What is the gain for EU? The gain for EU is 25 food. So the EU gains 25 food, which is 125 minus 25. So apologies, I just realized I did a wrong calculation here. Remember, this was 6F, right? So it's 25 times 6 here, which is actually 150. So I made a mistake here because the scenario 3 was 6F, and instead of trading at 4 food per 1 carbon, they would trade at 6 food per 1 carbon. So we just make that correction. Apologies for that. Okay, that's it. This is the things that you need to be able to understand and discuss. This is the end of everything related to week 2. From here on, we're going to touch week 3 soon.